Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and you're listening to The Business of Content, a podcast about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. Today, we're talking about a new political science study that measures how social media posts can distort reality, even when those posts link to legitimate news sources. Just about everybody's experienced a scenario like this. You read a highly nuanced article on a topic you find interesting. You then decide to share it on Facebook. Within minutes, a Facebook friend leaves a comment arguing with the premise of the article, and it's immediately obvious that this person hasn't actually read the piece in question. In fact, the vast majority of social media users will interact with content without actually clicking through and consuming it. One study from Columbia University found that 59% of links shared on social media aren't even clicked on. Data collected from HubSpot found that there is no correlation between retweets and clicks. So what does this mean for how we absorb information on social media? And how are we impacted by the commentary that social media users will often add when they're sharing a link? York College political science professor Nick Anspach wanted to answer these questions, so he devised an experiment to find out what information is retained when social media users see a post but don't click through to the source article. I interviewed Anspach about his results and whether social media has generated a net negative effect on how we monitor current events. Let's jump right into it. Hey, Nick, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, disclosures up front. You and I actually know each other. We've been good friends going all the way back to college. We've been to each other's weddings, so we know each other pretty well. So
yeah, we go way back. So go easy on me.
Yeah, and since this is about politics, I feel like we need to get our biases out there right away. So tell me about your background. You have a PhD and you're a university professor. What's your focus?
I study political behavior, specifically political communication and political psychology, mostly how people process and interpret different bits of political information.
And you got your PhD at Temple University, right?
At Temple University, and as you know, I went to Shippensburg University of Pennsylvania, which is a small state school in south central Pennsylvania. Very much farm country, very much Amish country. But, it provided me the springboard to get the PhD. So
very prestigious school. So let's start with, before we get into this current paper, so this isn't your first time doing research on this. I think your PhD dissertation had something to do with social media and its impact on political views. Can you talk a little bit about that and what you found there?
Sure, absolutely. So traditional media effects literature basically says that the media aren't as important as maybe some journalists would like to think, at least as far as political effects goes. And that's because people who follow politics tend to be those with hardened opinions already. I can attest to that, right? New messages that I read probably aren't going to fundamentally change the way in how I think about politics. Those that are most susceptible to the media's message are usually not following political news. They're on YouTube watching cat videos, or they're watching Jersey Shore, whatever it is the kids watch these days. They're just not
these are the people that like pundits call low information voters?
That's exactly right.
Which is very pejorative. I'm guessing they wouldn't like to hear themselves called that or admit to it.
Well, the nice thing is they're not paying attention, so they don't know anyways. But the idea is that because they're not paying attention to political information, they're not receiving the message in the first place. So either media effects, therefore, are kind of inconsequential because people either aren't receiving the message or those that do already have their minds made up. And what my dissertation was about social media. And I think the dynamic is fundamentally different here in that Facebook, we log on to Facebook or Twitter for all kinds of reasons, distraction, see what our friends are up to, entertainment, but we might get exposure to politics through social media inadvertently. So that's going to create that opportunity for maybe those who have the least sticky opinions. That's the very academic term for it. The least sticky opinions might be influenced by politics. So I investigated whether and how that's true.
And what did you find?
I found that's actually the case. So I had a little experiment on gun control where I hired people to post actual gun control posts on their Facebook news feeds. And then I randomly surveyed some of their top friends to see if those posts had an effect. And sure enough, it was those with the least amount of knowledge in politics or the least amount of interest in politics that were most influenced by these messages.
And did these people know ahead of time that you were going to be surveying them, or did you like come to them after the fact so that they didn't know to look out for something?
That's right. So they had no idea. Of course, their friends were in on it because they are the ones posting. But I told them, don't tell anybody that you're posting this because of an experiment. Pretend it's just organic, right? And it was really neat. They did a really good job with the experiment. You know how Facebook conversations tend to go, especially about politics. It's always back and forth, and they engaged with people who commented on these posts. And it unfolded like you would expect a political conversation on social media.
And so these friends, like they were actually able to regurgitate, even though they weren't specifically looking for it, they were able to kind of regurgitate talking points or news bits or statistics or something back to you that indicated that like this had an influence on them.
That project was less about specific knowledge, and it was just more on attitudes, whether or not people supported or opposed gun control measures.
But they were more likely or less likely to, based on the posting, whatever that view was, they were more or less likely.
Yeah, they were more likely to hold extreme attitudes because the posts that the people made were pretty extreme in their own right. Mm-hmm. And of course, I compared it to a control group who hadn't seen anything.
Mm-hmm. So that kind of segues into the study you just had out. Now, what kind of led up to you taking this project on?
So actually, it was Donald Trump. Forever ago, God, it seems like forever ago since he was inaugurated. But you'll remember right after the inauguration, he had the travel ban. And there was all kinds of legal scholarship about whether or not this travel ban was constitutional. This was before the court challenge and everything like that. And there was a Lawfare blog post that picked apart the executive order as it wound its way through the court system. I think this was in the Ninth Circuit Court. And this,
Lawfare, for people listening, it's like a legal blog with some like top legal scholars. It's generally well respected among journalists. They often link to it.
That's right. Once Lawfare started investigating this court case, they posted a blog post, and it was very, very, very critical of the way this executive order rolled out. But hidden within that blog post, there's also some language about how the Ninth Circuit Court did not even bother to cite some specific statute during the oral arguments of this case. And Trump tweeted about that very, very minor point in an otherwise very negative Lawfare blog post. I have the tweet right here. Trump says, "Remarkably, in the entire opinion, the panel did not even bother to cite this statute." End quote. And Trump editorialized it. It's a graceful decision. And it was interesting to me because anybody who just followed Trump on Twitter and did not read that original Lawfare blog post would think, oh my God, Lawfare is very much on the president's side in this case. So that was kind of the impetus to study whether or not I'm not necessarily interested in fake news per se, but whether people are able to misrepresent actual real news on social media accounts.
And if they magnify real news but with bad social commentary, does it have more good than bad? Because like you could say him sharing that article rather than a hyper-partisan article, maybe some subset of his followers would click through and actually be exposed to something that was negative towards Trump. So you wanted to see like what the net impact of someone like someone putting something that was untrue in terms of like a social media commentary summary, whether that outweighed whether the link they were sharing said something completely different.
That's right. So we didn't necessarily measure click-throughs on this article. Instead, we just went by the little article preview that showed up in the newsfeed for the post. But evidence indicates that click-throughs on political content is very, very, very small. So we're just more getting the information right from that newsfeed. But if you're linking to a legitimate source, like something like Lawfare or New York Times, it's going to lend you that credibility that you might not have otherwise.
And that's why I found your study kind of interesting, is because like there's been so much focus in the last 2 years has been on these fake news websites that we've heard so much about, and also just hyper partisan sites that they might not be sharing fake news, but they might be distorting it beyond like all belief. But your study actually focused on mainstream news sources, which I found interesting.
That's right. So we actually used a Yahoo article in our experiment because Yahoo's a fairly unbiased source, and it was one of the few, it seems like, that Trump hasn't attacked yet on Twitter as fake news.
Yeah, so like there was no like preconceived biases. So like if they shared a New York Times article, even though New York Times is considered like the gold standard, there's just so much political baggage with New York Times or CNN because like Trump and the conservatives have just bashed that so much that like people would dismiss it. Whereas if they saw Yahoo News, they don't necessarily have a strong opinion on it either way.
Right. I don't know who has a strong opinion on Yahoo one way or the other. I don't even think people who work at Yahoo have a strong opinion on Yahoo one way or the other.
Yeah.
So we use that as our treatment article, and we designed an experiment where people were either exposed to the full article with all the information, not even in the social media context. That's one group.
So they would have to sit there and read the article from start to finish.
That's right. And we're forcing them into a condition that they might not do in the real context, in their real lives. But for the sake of comparison, we force them to read this.
Yeah.
The next group, then, they received a fake news feed that I dummied up. It had 4 posts in it. One of them was the article preview, like you see on Facebook, of this Yahoo article.
Yeah, so when you most social media, I'm just kind of translating for you for the audience, but most people realize when they put a link into Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter, it creates like a preview that includes A, the headline, B, whatever title image that the like main feature image that they've designated as being the main feature image that Facebook automatically pulls. And then also within using software called the social graph, they can also input like a small summary, right? Like almost like a subtitle that appears usually below that. So
that's right. It's usually 2 or 3 lines of information or the beginning of an article. That's right.
So one group one group had to read an article from start to finish. One saw a social media post where there was no commentary on the post. It was just what would show up in that preview feed, in that preview box, right?
That's exactly right. But in that preview box was information about Trump's approval rating 6 months into his presidency. That's the time we ran the study. And I think it was right at 36%. So there was information within that post, even if it's not as much information as the full article.
And you used approval rating because it focused on a hard data point that was, done, through scientifically rigorous surveying. So like you could tie it to something very concrete.
Yeah. Politics is complicated and there's a lot of room for interpretation, but as you said, using a concrete number that's reported in the news, there's no arguing over what that number is as reported.
Mm-hmm. So we have the article, we have just the article preview, and then we have 2 more. What are the other 2 test cases?
So the other 2 are going to include that article preview, but they're going to include a commentary that's ideological in nature. So there's a liberal and a conservative commentary, and both are going to do the same thing. Both are going to cast doubt on that approval rating as reported in the poll. The liberal commentary is going to say, oh, this isn't true. They sampled more Republicans than Democrats in the poll. So therefore, like Trump's real approval rating is actually lower than what it would be. And the comment said it was like 23% instead of 36% approval rating.
Yeah.
And then the Republican or conservative commentary did the opposite. They would say, oh, no, they sampled too many Democrats in this poll, so Trump's real approval is higher than reported. So the comment suggested that his true approval rating was at 49%.
Yeah. That reminds me of, I don't know if you follow or know of this guy, Bill Mitchell. He's like this huge Trump supporter on Twitter. That's like his kind of bread and butter. He loves going into the crosstabs of these fake liberal polls, quote unquote, and like trying to cast doubt on it by constantly saying that they're oversampling Democrats. So this is definitely something that people do.
I hear that narrative a lot. And as someone who teaches public opinion and polling and surveying, I hate that because it'd be like saying, oh, well, this sample had more white people than black people in it. Well, that's reflective of the population. More people identify as Democrat than Republican. And it's a whole other can of worms why Republicans keep winning elections as if more people identify as Democrat, but yes, you get the point.
And plus, like, based on what I understand, is they don't weight by party in the polls; they weight by demographics, and it just comes out like they ask them what their party is, and then it shows that like there were more Democrats in the poll, but it wasn't because they like weighted it towards more Democrats. They just weighted it among like different age groups and demographics, and then the way it shook out was that there were, an accurate reflection that there are more registered Democrats than Republicans. But that's neither here nor there. We're kind of going off on a tangent. So you showed 4 different groups, these 4 different versions of the news. What did you find?
So then after they were exposed to either the article or the Facebook newsfeed, we collected some demographic information so they would kind of forget what they had just seen. So it's not so obvious what we're talking about. But then later on in the survey, we said, hey, we exposed you to some information about Trump's approval rating, and we want to ask you some questions about that. And one of the first questions was just, what is his approval rating? And sure enough, the folks in the full article condition were able to accurately say 36%. The people in that kind of plain post condition were able to say 36% because that was the only bit of information included. But in those other 2 conditions where there were 2 pieces of information provided to the subjects, they would cite the number that was in the comments rather than the number that was in that Yahoo News article preview.
And did you see any difference between the conservative version of the false comments versus the liberal version?
Well, they're both going to cite whichever number appears in that version. But as far as like liberals believing the liberal number or conservatives believing the conservative number, we actually tested for that in the article, and it's kind of lost near at the end because we kind of just shoehorned it in there. But there's a whole literature out there called motivated reasoning that people are more inclined to believe information with which they already agree. So you'd expect Democrats to want to believe Trump's approval rating is lower and Republicans to want to believe that it's higher. But we actually don't find that at all. People just went by the comments regardless of their partisan identity. And we were really, really surprised by this. So it seems like there's some kind of mechanism going on there besides just this motivated reasoning.
So you kind of talked about the term thought leader, and like it seems like, and out of all the different sourcing, like we seem to put more weight on people, on these quote unquote thought leaders, or the people that we're following or friends with on social media.
That's right. So this is another study I have to plug my own work. But again, in this study, I was interested in that idea of thought leader or opinion leader. What causes people, if anything, to read political news on Facebook or on Twitter if they're the type of person who doesn't really follow this stuff in their everyday life? So I had another experiment where I recruited people. And I said, hey, listen, tell me 5 to 10 people in your life who you think would also want to participate in a Facebook study. And they gave me that list, and I contacted those people, and I collected some information about them, about how they would share certain articles or comment certain articles. And I took that information that this secondary group gave me, and I went back to the first group, and I gave them, again, fake news feeds. And I asked them, hey, of these 4 or 5 articles in the newsfeed, which one would you pick? And I manipulated who shared each one. Sometimes it was strangers or fictional individuals I just made up sharing the information. Sometimes it was their own friends and family. And I was a little bit creepy with it. Like I went on these people's actual Facebooks, and I figured out like how their name was displayed on their profile. And I actually copy pasted their profile pictures into my experiments to get it to look as realistic as possible. And it turns out when it's strangers or fictional individuals sharing information, people are no more inclined to pick political content. But when it's their friends and families sharing political content, yeah, they'll ignore their cat videos for politics. But even more interestingly, they'll cross the aisle to when their friends and family are sharing something. So if someone's a big liberal, they might be more in line to read a Fox News article or a Breitbart article, very conservative outlets, if their friends are sharing it. Whereas like in traditional media affects literature, that's not the case. People tend to select from sources with which they agree.
Mm-hmm. So this study seems to at least suggest that there are deleterious effects of people who get exposed to political news in their Facebook news feed, even if they're not seeking it out. But I kind of like to play devil's advocate. I wonder if this could be a good thing in some ways, because it is at least making them more literate in current events. Like when I was growing up, pre-internet or current version of the internet, it was pretty easy to avoid hard news. Like you had to either pick up a newspaper or turn on the news to actually be exposed to it. Whereas just about everybody uses social media and is scrolling through their feed. I don't know, in terms of net effects, obviously that's a little bit larger than the scope of what this was trying to measure. But what are your thoughts on that in terms of the information that they're being exposed to?
Sure. It's funny that you bring that up, because that's actually what one of our reviewers said in an earlier draft of this article, was that we were too doom and gloom with our findings. So that kind of forced us to consider your question and how we could consider some of those positive effects. And it's true, even people who think they are informed on a topic, even if they're not necessarily hold correct beliefs or correct information, but those who think they're informed are just more engaged in politics, right? They're more likely to vote, they're more likely to contribute, even if they're not more knowledgeable in one specific issue area. The fact that they're consuming more information might increase their knowledge in the other issue areas.
Yeah, and make them more confident to show up to vote, even if they're only
more confident.
Yeah. It seems like you're suggesting that even if they're exposed a little bit but to news, it might be that adds some small percentage likelihood that they might get more civically engaged or in some way.
That's right. And turnout, of course, is a great thing, but I also would say let's take that one step further. And if we get increased turnout from these people, what does that mean? We have a bunch of uninformed people voting, and maybe they're voting against their interests, right? Mm-hmm. So more turnout, more engagement is a good thing, as long as they're doing it in a way that forwards whatever. More turnout and more engagement is a good thing, as long as they're using that turnout and engagement to better their own situation.
Yeah. Well, I think this study really points to how we have to assess a lot of information very quickly when we stumble across news. When I see a social media post, I'm considering three different things. What's the URL of the site the person is linked to? Is it linking to nytimes.com, or is it linking to Breitbart or Gateway Pundit? Usually I'll use that as the first kind of indicator of how quickly I'll dismiss it. And then how much do I trust this person? And then the third thing, what you're kind of studying here, is what added commentary is the person contributing. And I try to be, I think I go out of my way to be a super conscientious news consumer and consume a lot of different sources. But when I'm doing this process hundreds of times a day, when I'm scrolling through social media, I'm going to make some wrong judgments and probably absorb some wrong facts, I'm guessing.
Maybe, but you're probably doing yourself a disservice there, because you're an educated guy. You're very much plugged into this world. I would like to think I use some of the same shortcuts that you're using. I don't think your average Facebook or Twitter user, though, is as savvy with being able to discern a Breitbart from a Fox News from a CNN. So I think that's where this opportunity of your friends really comes into play. The fact that you have these thought leaders or opinion leaders, they're basically saying, hey, this was important and right enough for me to share, so therefore we can use that itself as a shortcut.
Yeah, because every now and then I see someone sharing 100% fake news, the kind that Snopes would debunk, and I always think I think the URL was patriotnewstoday.com. I didn't look at that URL and just oh, maybe I should Google this or see if there's anybody else doing this. But yeah, I guess you're right. They're not really looking. If it looks like a legit news site, then they're not really looking much beyond that.
Or even just the memification of news, it's not even linked to a specific outlet, but it's
just an image with text over it or something like that, and you don't even know what the original source is.
And there's a phenomenon called information herding, where maybe I'm skeptical of the first time I see that. But if I see 5 or 6 or 10 of my friends all sharing the same article or the same meme or the same picture, right, all of a sudden that's going to make me think it as more credible, even at a subconscious level, because I'm getting it from so many different people, even though they might be getting it all from that same flawed source.
I also have to say, and this is completely anecdotal, so which obviously, when we're talking about political science, it's inadmissible to your research. But I really like that I can scroll through Twitter and the people I follow and trust. They surface the most interesting, newsworthy parts of an article and quote them right in the tweet, or like they'll do a screen grab of a specific paragraph from a New York Times article and call out this really interesting anecdote or something like that. Like I think that it can, when done well, that whole the commentary layer on social media. Like there are times where I haven't read an article, but I've seen so many people commenting on it that I feel like I've gotten all of the relevant parts of the article without having to spend all the time on it. I don't know. Like I definitely think there's a good side to it as well.
Yeah, the editorializing is fantastic, and that was one of the reasons. Like in addition to the Trump story I told you at the earlier in the podcast, one of the reasons why we wanted to study commentary, not just sharing of fake news or misinformative news. And I think a lot of people do the same thing that you do, where they're reading the commentary more than the full article or even the article preview. And I think this is one of the reasons why we might not have found the results of the mechanism, thinking that, oh, Democrats are just going to believe Democratic things, Republicans are going to believe Republican things. I don't think it's necessarily motivated reasoning that explains our results in this last study. I think it's just that people are lazy, or maybe not lazy, using these shortcuts. They might not even realize that there are two pits of information there that contradict each other. They might just be reading the comments, ignoring the preview, and then going on with their day thinking that they have learned.
And these are just also just evolved, like heuristics we've evolved. Like we take it, we are designed to be able to have to like sort through information very quickly, whether it's just visual information in terms of walking and being able to blur out things that aren't important, to even just information. So like it's just there's no way that we're going to read every single article on the internet, so we have to find a way to kind of heuristically consume very quickly and sort that information in either true, fake, or quasi true buckets, and we're just not built to do it super well.
I'll tell you what, it's hell on my magazine stack next to my bed. Like I feel like I'm getting a lot of these articles now through social media, where I have a stack of Economist magazines on one side of the bed and New Yorker articles on the other side. I'm just not getting around to them because I'm like, oh, I've already seen this on Facebook or on Twitter, but I haven't read the entire thing yet.
Well, hopefully you're choosing the New Yorker over the Economist. Last question. So there was this recent study that 44% of people between the ages of 18 and 27 are deleting Facebook off their phones en masse. I don't know if you saw that study.
I didn't.
Yeah, it's pretty high. So it doesn't mean that they're 44% are quitting. It doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that they're quitting Facebook or deleting their accounts. They're just deleting Facebook off their phones. I guess they don't.
My wife just did that. She still has an account, but she got rid of the app.
And then there was also a recent Pew study. This was a little bit older, but showing that for the first time ever, fewer people are saying they get their news from Facebook. So as long as this study's been going on, every single year, the number of people who said that they got their news from Facebook was going up. And for the first time, we've seen a decline. And then we've also, since Trump was elected, there's been a huge uptick in people becoming digital subscribers, like paying subscribers of mainstream publications like the New York Times and the Washington Post, which seems to indicate that people are starting to understand more the value of these news organizations. And then there's also a huge adoption of like more kind of news aggregation apps like Apple News, where you're less likely to come across partisan outlets and more mainstream news. And I wonder if you think this represents the public turning away from social media and recognizing, at least intuitively, if not explicitly, some of the negative effects that you outline in your study. That like people in mass are realizing that Facebook is having an impact on their information diet, even if they don't know exactly how it's impacting it, and realizing that
I think that's right. There was a recent Pew study within the past few years that showed that I forget the exact number, but it's anywhere between a quarter and a third of Facebook users weren't confident in their ability to spot fake news on social media. I think it was on Facebook specifically. And Facebook, Twitter, for all their talk about getting a handle on misinformation shared through their platforms. I just don't know how or whether that's possible. So I think you're right. I think it represents a turn away from what could have been this great tool for spreading information and more of a turn towards verified, trusted outlets.
All right, Nick. Well, those were all the questions I had for you. Where can people find you online?
My Twitter handle is at Nick, Nick _Anspach, ANSPACH. That's about the only social media account I have, and even that's barely active. It's funny. I stuff, but
I would point people to this paper, but it's behind a paywall, right?
It is. Although, if you have like a link to this podcast, I can give you a link to the free paper.
Okay, that sounds good.
Yeah.
All right,
let's do that.
All right, Nick. Well, this was a lot of fun. Thanks so much for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me, Simon. Take care.
Okay, that's all we have for you today. Be sure to subscribe to the Business of Content on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. See you next week.